Hello. Welcome to the New South Wales Community of Practice webinar series. My name is Louisa Mamuni, and as host of the webinar today, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we are meeting. I'm on Gadigal land, and wherever you may be joining us from, I'd like to pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. Christopher Walker is the Deputy Dean of the University Relations and Academic Director of the Executive Masters of Public Administration at the Australian and New Zealand School of Government, ANZSOG as you might know it, an Adjunct Professor, School of Government and International Relations, Griffith University, Queensland. Chris, I don't know how you keep up with all of that, but it's a very impressive title. Prior to joining ANZSOG, Chris was the head of School of Social Sciences at the University of New South Wales from 2012 to 2018, and prior to joining ANZSOG, Chris was also and worked in academic leadership for the New South Wales Government over 20 years. And he worked in senior executive positions and in policy in the Departments of Health, Road Transport Authority, Rail Safety and the Cabinet Office, a very esteemed policy institution if you can remember that long ago. Chris operates at the interface of academia and public sector agencies and plays an active role in executive education with public servants across Australia and New Zealand in the fields of public policy, public sector management, public value, regulation and compliance. And his most recent publications, if you'd like to check them out, include Regulatory Transfer and Transitioning Economies in the Journal of Policy Studies and Digital Regulation, a New Frontier for Public Service Delivery. And that's a book published by Powergrey, if you'd like to check that out also. So we'd really like to hear more from Chris because I think he has quite significant insights into regulation and compliance in using digital services now that we're all working kind of remotely and the technology is improving so much more. This gives us a whole lot of new ways in which we can the government can involve ourselves in the lives of the citizens of New South Wales and to ensure and improve our regulatory services. So Chris, I might hand over to you and for your presentation, and for our audience there'll be an opportunity to discuss and to ask Chris questions after the main presentation. So thank you, and I'll hand over to you.
Sorry,
thanks,
before
Louisa.
you start, Chris.
I want to thank Louisa and Oscar for organising today, inviting me along. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to you all. And as a long-time public servant in New South Wales, it's great to have an audience like yourselves. And the best career I ever had was working in some of the departments in the New South Wales government. I really enjoyed myself very much. And I draw on that experience extensively in my work now. It's been a fantastic body of experience to have to do further research into regulation and public policy. So the presentation I've got, so Louisa, just give me a nod if this slides are up. Okay, thank you. Like Louisa said, everyone got the flyer. I want to talk about digitisation and its impact on public services. And the case study or the examples I've got are about regulation. So certainly if we think about digitisation, all the agencies that you represent, that you're working in, would have some activity involved in looking at digitising particular aspects of your services or the way you work in terms of managing your business internally or liaising with clients or regulators or customers or professions. So it's happening to all of us, and it's a big topic to talk globally. So I'd like to just kind of try and focus on what does it mean for regulation, because I think that's quite an interesting area of impact. So the focus of my talk is I would want to talk about just broadly the government's commitment to regulation, to digitisation, and then some of the benefits and challenges, and then I'm going to go to my case studies and then from there draw on some conclusions and analysis. I'll definitely make sure I try and wrap up within 30 minutes so that we've got plenty of time for discussion. So the first slide here is really just making the point that digitisation and government are inherently interrelated now, and that technology in itself plays such a critical role in kind of influencing the structure and the way governing and the governing process happens. And back in those early days, when we were putting all our forms into PDFs and putting them online and using the internet, I mean, the whole thinking was that this would kind of move us to a framework of interaction that would lead to higher levels of participation and engagement, that it would change the way public services are interacting with communities, and that we would see closer collaboration between parties. And I think even though that was the thinking a decade ago, there's still a sense that digitisation is helping agencies extend their engagement with communities and stakeholders that they're working with. And certainly from a government position, there's high levels of commitment to see the progress of digitisation of services. We've got and I think it was in 2017, the Australian Digital Council was set up. So we have ministerial representation from all states and territories and the Commonwealth in looking at what's happening across our nation in terms of public sector services. And each year, the council produces the State of the Data and Digital Nation annual report. So if you want to have a look at what's happening across the country, you can have a look at their annual report. It gives you some insight of some of the initiatives across particular states and territories. And one of the key Commonwealth agencies set up to help progress digitisation, certainly across Commonwealth agencies, but give a sense of structure and format for the nation, it was the establishment of the Digital Transformation Agency, which has a strong commitment to progressing digitisation. And if you look around the world, we see these same sort of setups happening in other countries. And I've got just a couple of examples there on the slides in terms of agencies set up in Canada, New Zealand and the UK. And then, of course, what we've gone through in the past 18, 20 months with COVID, and the need for distancing, but yet still some form of engagement with clients of public sector agencies, this massive acceleration across a number of organisations to increase the rollout of digital services. So here at ANZSOG, one of the things that we did over the past 12 months is we had a look at, I got a little team, and we looked at all the kind of strategies that government departments in Australia, New Zealand, a few other countries have published on digitisation. And we tried to get a sense of the broad-based themes, like what are governments across Australia, New Zealand and around the world saying that digitisation will deliver for them. And we kind of identified a few broad-based differences. So some governments, I'm speaking pretty much directly to the slide there, but some governments see it as a way of connecting people. And so we saw this particularly in jurisdictions where perhaps the disadvantage was more evident. So the digitisation strategies from Tasmania and the Northern Territory really emphasised practical ways of engaging with communities. Some governments had a really strong whole of government approach, and it was about trying to maximise service efficiency. That was certainly characteristic of the New South Wales strategy. And others are looking at, innovation, and the strategy talks about regularly updating and connecting back with communities and providing progress reports on how digitisation is happening. And every strategy has a sense or notes the importance of like cyber safety and ensuring that citizens' data is secure and safe. So there's some there's a bit of a range in the way they approach digitisation. But in terms of themes, we found it's about people at the centre, that is recognition about digital inclusion, that this is essential, that this is a very important aspect of how you might engage communities, and this idea of data-driven innovation. So digitisation is really providing governments and the agencies of governments with high volumes of data that guides decision-making. And then there's this sense that, with collecting data on a more frequent and regular basis and having more fine-grained data, that policies and services could be slightly more responsive and agile to changes in the environment. But it was also noting the importance of training and development of public servants, that digitisation and managing services of this sort of nature requires a new skill set, or extending the skill set of public servants. And there's a lot of discussion in all the reports about the administrative burden, that quite often digitisation should be not so much about putting those paper forms into PDF format and just shifting the administrative burden from internal to external, so getting everyone else to fill out the form for us, but trying to, if you think about the ATO, pre-populate some of those forms so that actually the administrative burden is diminished, which might lead to high levels of compliance, high levels of participation and engagement. And certainly around the world, a lot of the discussion is about what this means for improving efficiency of services, saving money, and kind of getting this parallel match between what agencies are doing and citizens' expectations based on their own experience and observations of what's happening in the private sector. So there's an inevitability about this in terms of government departments behaving in a way and acting in a way and providing services in a way which is consistent with the experiences that people are experiencing when they interact with the private or community sector. And in terms of just the benefits, I've just got a slide here that summarises some of those, and you'd all be familiar with them. But, this idea of increasing accessibility, trying to increase the level of ease and convenience. I've talked about cost. And there is an argument about the capacity to have more tailored services to individuals. So the extent to which having a robust digital framework might allow that is often mentioned. This idea of joining up and data sharing, that a more holistic view could be obtained by collecting data around a particular issue from diverse sources so that a more comprehensive response could be developed. And also, though, giving clients a little bit more agency in terms of their relationship with departments and how they might manage that. But there's challenges as well. And I know there's a lot on this slide, but really I'll just point to a few. There's still a level of skepticism. And certainly when I was a public servant, interorganisational trust was a big challenge. Sharing data across agencies is a bit of an issue, and some organisations have legislative constraints in the extent to which they can share data. So there is the extent to which we might have a holistic database or sharing of information faces some barriers. And then particularly what is more frequently discussed now is this kind of embedded prejudice within AI and automated decision-making systems, that they may reflect certain biases, unconscious biases, and we need to be aware of that when we're digitising decision-making processes. And one of the things, a colleague and mine, Siobhan Sullivan and I, we did some work on the effect of digitisation on disadvantaged communities. And one of the things is, while there's higher levels amongst individuals in terms of, we see growth and understanding and take up of digital devices, and so that might give us a sense that the digital divide is narrowing. We also have a case where there's higher levels of services being digitised. So whilst the gap is narrowing, the actual hole is getting deeper. So the capacity for social exclusion is actually far greater for those who are not active in the digital field. So whilst we can see the gap narrowing, we also need to be aware, for those that aren't participating, what they're missing out on has accelerated because there's so much digitisation happening. So for those who are missing out, their chances of being excluded are actually far greater than ever before. So what does it mean in practice? So one of the good things about working at ANZSOG is I get to liaise and work with public servants from across Australia and New Zealand. So this year, when I was teaching the Executive Masters program, in one of my classes, I asked the participants, we had 100 students from across Australia and New Zealand, middle to senior level executives. I asked them to give us an indication of those key drivers shaping digitisation in their agencies. So I pulled out this the other day when I was preparing for this presentation to give us a sense of the 4 drivers. And you can see here, this is a word cloud, so the largest word is the most commonly entered word, that efficiency is really, from a public sector from a manager of public services, efficiency is the number one factor influencing digitisation. But we've got other issues here: access, transparency, the provision of information, customer service. So there is a broad overview of some of those key drivers, but still from an agency perspective, what's shaping digitisation of services is fundamentally efficiency. So it's seen that it's a better way, a more efficient way of doing things. In terms of regulation, when I speak to regulators, and I do a bit of work with some of the regulatory programs that ANZSOG delivers as well, and we hear from regulators that digitisation is happening everywhere, not only internal processes, but in terms of monitoring and surveillance, and that's what I want to talk about a bit, but licensing, this sort of database integration so that they get a broader perspective of what's happening in the regulatory field, remote and virtual forms of inspection, particularly now with COVID. So there's a whole lot of changes happening in organisations that are engaged in regulation, and this is having, it's reshaping or changing the nature of the relationship between the agency and the client, or the agency and the regulatory, and how they interact. And some of that interaction, it's worth noting, is not only the capability of the agency to deal with digitisation, but the capability of who you're regulating to deal with digitisation, because quite often those capabilities are different, and the extent to which you can digitise might either be constrained by their capability, or they could be waiting for you to catch up. So it is an interesting dynamic there. So the next couple of minutes, I just want to go over a couple of case studies, and I'm interested in how digitisation is shaping regulatory practice. And the things that I want to talk about are this idea about whether we're entrenching command and control to the extent to which digitisation might be, I suppose, enforcing a very traditional approach to regulation. It's still an important and necessary tool. But the conversation that we're having with communities and regulatory systems is how do we get a more engaging form of regulation, and that might be about how do we get high levels of feedback. But also I want to talk about the extent to which we might be bringing third parties, intermediaries, into the regulatory field, and how does that assist with regulatory governance and any other noticeable effects. So I'll move on to my case studies. I am going to show a short video in a second, so I'll have to switch screens. But all my case studies are from the transport field. I spent a lot of time working in transport. I loved it. It was the best job I ever had, I think. I really enjoyed that. And so I've been still liaising with public sector transport agencies in terms of my research. So the first one's about, which everyone in New South Wales would be familiar with, the detection of illegal phone use in the car. So I'm going to switch screens and play this video. Put the sound on. So you should have this.
On the Clunies Ross Street overpass above the M4 near Prospect, this is the camera catching more drivers red-handed than any other. Fines have been issued since March to drivers using their phones. Over the first 4 months, more than 14,000 were caught, one every 12 minutes on average, raising more than $6.4 million, almost as much as every police officer in the state issued in fines for the same offence in a whole year.
This government's discovered the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow.
People just stayed off them. This wouldn't need to happen.
Almost 10% of those caught paid a company fine, claiming the driver couldn't be identified. It's 5 times as much as the normal fine, but the 5 demerit point penalty is escaped.
Some of these drivers should have lost their licences. They shouldn't be on the road. We're open to working with the government to fix this problem.
The first drivers to challenge their fines appeared in court last week. 7 News can reveal all have so far failed to have them overturned. Parliament has been considering a bill to strengthen the laws by reversing the onus of proof. Drivers effectively guilty unless they prove they weren't holding their phones. The state government is now hopeful the changes won't be needed.
I want to thank and recognise the judiciary for backing in what is a really important program to save lives.
Alex Hart, 7 News.
So, thank you. Sorry about that. Just let me get back. Screen sharing is a little bit slightly time consuming. Okay, so I like that video because it does give us a bit of a snapshot of a summary of that account of particularly both the politics and the community attitude. It kind of illustrates to me, if you think of the data, you know, one camera earning more in revenue fines than the whole police force, it shows you the extensive reach that this digital technology can do in terms of surveillance. The other thing that what we seem to see happen is this reverse onus of proof, because administratively the processing becomes a lot quicker and easier. But what are the kind of civil rights and social justice implications of doing that? It becomes incredibly difficult for people who are not articulate and vocal to appeal against something that might have been an error. And in this case illustrates the incredible capacity of digital technology to monitor very highly specified non-compliant human behaviour. So we are getting quite narrow now in terms of what we're able to measure. And it kind of illustrates the contestable understandings about what we're regulating. Like, is this about safety or is this about revenue? That it changes the nature of the public debate given the kind of extensive monitoring and surveillance. And it presents interpretation of road safety, and this is kind of a bit more of a sort of a theoretical issue, but if you collect data on something that's associated with a problem, you kind of entrench the understanding of that problem that way, and it may distract from other important factors, more important factors that are contributing to the problem in road safety, like driver competence might be an important issue as much, if not more, than, say, using your mobile phone. And I don't know about you, but myself as a driver, you know, we've all been in that moment where we all have reached for our phones and felt that it was safe to do so. So people in their own agency have a question about that. The next case is about digital licensing, which illustrates a different perspective. The interesting thing about digital licensing, and everybody here would have experienced in terms of the app that we now have through Services New South Wales, is we see regulation, licensing is a form of regulation, you know, having a much more interactive capability, that there's a connection. It's very devolved to the individual in this case. There's a lot of real-time aspects, particularly in terms of how it's now being connected to the QR code and COVID issues, checking in, checking out. And there's a relationship that's much closer to the regulatee and how they behave and the data you collect from them. So there's almost this sense of a stronger level of connection. And in fact, this type of digitisation can be extended further. We have, you know, we use kind of like citizen scientists to monitor things, and what we're seeing here is digitisation taking on a much more different form of regulation and engagement, where we have the capacity to engage others to contribute. So I think licensing in that sense has opened up a new way of engagement with those that are regulated that perhaps we haven't experienced before. And the third example I've got is about a trucking regulatory system developed in Australia. which I've done a lot of research on, and started in the New South Wales, what was then the RTA, and that's about an intelligent access program where we have a system where private telematic providers who provide data to the trucking industry have developed robust certified systems that have been certified by an agency set up by the Road Authority's Transport Certification Australia, that they're tamper-proof and they monitor heavy vehicles 24/7. And so what they monitor, the road agency might approve for an extra long or an extra heavy vehicle, or it might be significantly wider than what's normally permitted. But they are only permitted to travel if they're monitored by this data tracking system. And they may be required to travel on a specified route. They may be required to travel a specified time. They may be required to travel within certain speed limits. And the data tracking firm will track the vehicle according to those regulatory requirements. And only when the vehicle breaks the rules is a report generated that then goes back to the road agency for the road agency to decide what level of prosecution they might undertake, whether it's a warning or a penalty. So we have a relationship between the transport industry that wants higher levels of flexibility. It wants to see the regulatory framework give more space for those parts of the industry that are prepared to be monitored much more vigorously. And in return, they want concessions on the regulatory system. They want to have longer vehicles, heavier vehicles. They want to be able to increase their productivity, but by giving in to 24/7 surveillance around certain conditions. So we've set up a regulatory model that's quite boutique in a sense. Not everybody is under this, but it's dependent on private firms providing the data, doing the tracking, and then giving a report when the rules are broken. So all that government is getting is when the rules are broken. They're not getting the 24/7 data monitoring, they're only getting when breaches happen. So this model shows you how, again, digitisation is extending the surveillance capability of the state, but it's done in a different way. It's done in partnership with a third-party provider. There's kind of this codependent relationship between the three parties. This model only works if third-party providers provide the surveillance and monitoring. And it only works if road agencies are prepared to give concessions on their regulatory conditions. But what we have is a much more intensive model of regulation that allows for these more nuanced and kind of responsive regulatory design to the demands of industry. So we see this happening in certain specific industries that might want to have longer or heavier vehicles, and it's happening all around the country. So this authority, TCA, is monitoring with third parties trucking concessions, thousands of different very precise rule adjustments to allow vehicles to respond to the nature of the industry they're in, whether it's carrying ore or livestock or certain other goods. So regulation, digitisation here has really given regulation quite a responsive capacity. So what are the issues? Just to summarise, getting to the end, how do we keep up with this? Because what we're seeing in the field in terms of digital technology is a pace of reform which is far greater than the policy process. So, you know, in your seminars that you've had about how do we work with policy, you know yourself from your own experience, policy moves at a different pace. So how do we get the alignment? And what about the skills? I mentioned it earlier. Like public sector agencies, this is a new field of technology. We don't necessarily have all the skills. So how do we bring those skills in to make these systems work well and show concern for all those issues that public sector agents should be aware of, not only the efficiency side, but the social justice and rights sides and things like that, the security aspects. And this idea that surveillance, you know, how do you moderate for that fear or lack of trust in government? You don't want to undermine the confidence in government by having regulatory systems that are so extensive in their surveillance capability. And I've just got 2 more slides to sum up. So basically, there's another thing about volume. digitisation collects massive volume. So if you don't act on evidence of transgression, then you kind of have the challenge of undermining the legitimacy of the rule framework. In other words, if you detect offences, we need to react. And that's a challenge about digitisation in terms of collecting more information than we can manage. And ICT and cameras, I think they've really extended the capability of command and control, and we need to moderate that because there's a bit of a backlash, and we've seen that with the example of the cameras. But how do we use digitisation to expand the mix so that we can get a mix of self-regulation, what we're all doing with the QR codes, which is we are self-regulating to the rules, we're checking in, no one is there's not an officer forcing us to do that. We're monitoring our behaviour ourselves. And how might we engage that with other forms of regulation? And then the final slide I've got here is about in the agency itself, how do you integrate and how do you get alignment? How might digitisation help build a more comprehensive and coherent understanding of compliance? So here's an example of the non-compliant pub. If you think about the pub, they've got work injuries are monitored by Safe Work. Food is monitored by a separate food authority. The business side is monitored by Fair Trading. Serving alcohol to minors is monitored by Liquor and Gaming. So one organisation is subject to multiple regulatory authorities. How do we bring all that intelligence together to get a single view of compliance? That's good for the business, so they know what they're up for. That's good for the regulator in terms of understanding where the performance of that one entity might be strong and where it might be weak. How do you bring that together to deliver more effective services? So I might wrap it up there, Louise, if that's all right. I'll stop sharing my screen and I'm happy to take questions.
Yes. And would you like to share your other video or we'll move on to questions?
Look, it's an example of digitisation in the environmental sector. If it comes up in the questioning, I can definitely play it because it's an interesting snapshot of how we count fish in crocodile-infested waters.
So ask a question on something to do with the environment so we can get to see that video. Right, so if you have a question for Chris, please write it into the chat and then I'll coordinate between our audience to see who should go first. While you're thinking of your questions, I'll start off with a question for you, Chris. My kind of experience in digitisation of, I guess, new programs is that government often wants to do a lot more than we're actually capable of. I think human kind of imaginations kind of take off, and it's an enormous challenge, I think, for both policy and program areas to try and keep up with the expectations of ministers and senior decision makers. Do you have any kind of suggestions for how, as the public service or as a policy officer, we might go about supporting our senior decision makers to have a more realistic expectation of what digital services can provide?
Yeah, I think there's two dimensions to it. I think where a lot of digitisation plans, projects, activities that agencies might be thinking about designing and trying to deliver may not have a full understanding of capability. So some of the research we've done where we looked at digitisation of activities around trades, licenses and things like that, is that quite often the regulatee, the tradie, we really don't have a full grasp of their capability in the field. And I think a lot of public sector agencies either overestimate the capability out there. So you're trying to get sort of online systems happening in an environment where perhaps those small firms and businesses actually are lagging in the capability compared to what the public sector agency has achieved in its own kind of digitisation of its own work processes, or the diversity and capability. We've underestimated that, where we've got a group of there's a cluster of small businesses and individuals who are highly capable, and this is, trucking is a classic example. The example I gave you about the kind of 24/7 remote monitoring, that's really looking after the top end of the industry. They are capable and able. They're already monitoring the movement of their own vehicles 24/7. So all they're really doing, in a sense, because is allowing the reporting of when their vehicles go off route or speed. And generally those firms are interested in that themselves. So in a sense, we've got an alignment between the business interest of the firm and the regulatory interest of the state. Whereas you can go right from, in the trucking sector, you can go right down to the bottom where, if you can't read and write, trucking and driving was always the industry you could work in, because that was, you didn't really necessarily need those skills. That's historically how many firms recruited drivers. So the diversity of capability is so great, and I think understanding that before you kind of initiate the action is really important in terms of determining the success of the project.
Thanks. So we've got some questions now coming in. Natalie, I'd like you to ask your question, please, first.
Hi, Chris. Sorry, just having some technology issues. Thanks for your presentation. It's been really interesting. I just had a question around when you were talking about volume and needing to act on compliance where you see issues. And I just found it a really interesting point, given in different roles that I've been in, like you might identify non-compliance given the volume of data that you're receiving, but I question whether you actually be able to act on that given the data may not have been collected for that purpose. It might be incidental that you start finding, examples of non-compliance. And so I was just wondering if you had any suggestions on how that might be addressed.
Yeah, look, I think volume's a real issue because it workload, demand, resources, is it worth the investment in terms of what you're doing? And I was trying to point to volume because if you're digitising, particularly in the surveillance and regulation field, if you collect the data of non-compliance, you need to understand how you're going to manage that. And volume can suddenly throw you out, and because then you run the risk of being an ineffective regulator. Like, it undermines legitimacy. Like, it is a real issue. But one of the pressures of volume is that you do what's happened with speed cameras, is that the way you manage is say, oh, well, you can't appeal. We reverse the onus of proof. So everyone's automatically guilty until proven otherwise. And then you can manage volume. So volume is kind of problematic for rights, because our kind of immediate and easy response to volume is don't allow appeal mechanisms. But that kind of isn't fair. So you kind of find yourself trapped in a corner almost, where you might be acting against the public interest just to manage the volume. So I think I'm kind of arguing you've got to do the analysis way up front to understand, if we're going to get this volume, what are we going to do with it? And in terms of incidental collection, that's the other thing that you've pointed out, because it sounds like your example was you got volume of breaches when you weren't looking for breaches. And that creates another dilemma, and the agency, I think, has to work out what they want to do about that, or how do you structure rules so that you're clear that what you're collecting data for is only for one purpose and one purpose only, and you really ring fence that and it's defensible. It's a dilemma.
David, we have a question from you. Would you like to come on? Thank you.
Sure, I guess, is my camera working? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, my question's a little bit, so it's more about process. So I'm from the early childhood space, and we have a very complex mix of regulatory models, and one area we look at is family daycare. And so they have a provider, and the provider kind of regulates them themselves, and they have a mix of co-regulatory where they regulate themselves, and we directly regulate some aspects. But some things we're looking at is ways in which we can digitize the space. And we've noticed that some areas of the sector have difficulty in digitizing. So how do you, I guess, what's the government's role in digitization, and how do you kind of wrestle with supporting the end users of the sector, but also kind of, do we pull them along, or do we just kind of, do we align ourselves to the capacity of the sector?
Okay, great question. I've kind of got a personal philosophy. It's kind of leadership and lift the public sector. Okay, so leadership is certainly something that everyone should be practicing, but how do you do that with and not either push people out of business, like good performers who don't have the capability, but have no legitimate reason not to be there? They should still be there, but if it's just due to technical capability, that's a bit unfair. But you can only lift the floor if you raise the ceiling. So it's a continuous process. So I think this, it's about supplementary. For me, I would be looking at, how does a digital option supplement the regulatory framework so that those that are able and capable gain a benefit? And whether it's an efficiency or the burden is, the administrative burden is less, and that kind of then lingers as an incentive for others to catch up if they want to. But you're not penalising those who don't. So it's kind of the and your industry that you're talking about, and family daycare, I've got a personal favourite. They saved my life. So great. Great area to work in, but how do you support the growth and the development of the industry? And I think digitisation, you shouldn't stop it because there's segments of the industry that aren't capable to do that, but at the same time, you got to kind of lift the sector, and doing things in partnership with participants that demonstrates kind of less administrative burden or better efficiency or sharper analysis, I think is an absolute necessity.
Yeah, great, thank you.
No worries.
The next question that we'll go to is Megan Ganesh, but her camera is not working, so she asked me to ask her on her behalf. She says, how do Australian governments compare with the US and EU governments when striking the balance when it comes to adoption of digitisation and innovation, and of protecting citizen privacy and rights?
Okay, I don't know. I can't answer. I haven't done the work on privacy and rights, so I honestly can't answer that question. I don't have the knowledge, so sorry about that. In terms of kind of digital services and digital innovation, when we did the kind of international review, we only looked at strategies and tried to find examples of what different sectors were doing. But we were particularly impressed with the level of sophistication and the kind of diversity of applications in Australia. So we felt that Australia was really quite up there in terms of digitisation. But I would say that COVID has accelerated everybody's interest globally, that the idea of this kind of remote analysis, remote collection of data, remote forms of engagement and inspection, has, even prison visits, remote, doing that online, having visitors through, things like Teams or whatever, all those things have happened across every policy sector. So I would not be too sure where we're at in international comparative performance now, but certainly, when we did the analysis late last year, we were really pleased to see where Australia was sitting.
Yeah, I think Australia should be well placed based on its level of, I guess, sophistication and development, the comfort that we do show as Australians in allowing the government to come into our lives, and the degree of innovation and various, learning, I think, within from like jurisdictions across Australia is always kind of very helpful and sets Australia up to kind of learn from within. Our next question is from Robert, and he asks my favourite question, which is, can we learn from some failures, please? But Robert, do you want to come in and ask your question more directly?
Failures.
No, I think you asked that very well, but it's a success or a failure war story is always good. Like to hear a bit of narrative. Thanks.
Yeah, I didn't research failures, and I don't have any from my own career experience either, to be honest. But I can talk about, like, we all know the IT failures, don't we? Every agency's had an IT system that's failed, and digitisation is kind of almost incrementally on the back of that. And what we observe, particularly when I've done some interviews with agencies, is they've talked about breaking it down into smaller projects. So no one's doing the big, massive, $160 million IT reform. They're doing the, the $5 million or even less, the application or they're doing little things that actually do make a difference in service engagement. So that's one thing. But the other thing is the longevity. So, that Intelligent Access Project, the satellite tracking of heavy vehicles that I discussed, that started in the 1990s. Like when I was in the RTA, I got a graduate trainee and we had a box computer, and it was with one lobby group from the trucking industry that we got together, and they wanted concessions, and we said, oh, well, we'll have to monitor your movement and you'll have to pay for it. And they set up the computer and everything in the RTA's office so that we could monitor the movement of their cranes. But it took, that was in 1998 or something, or 1999. And the program as a national program didn't launch until 2013. So the genesis of some of these things just takes a very long time. And it wasn't the tech, it's the legalities, it's the policy framework and the regulatory structures that you put in place that manage these systems. This is where everything's going to fall apart. It's got nothing to do with tech anymore. It's all about the policy and the legislative framework and structure that governs how information is stored, shared, how long it's kept for, what are the appeals processes and things like that. That's why I kind of like to point out we've got to be a bit cautious about the institutional preference for reversing the onus of proof, because we do it, but it's because digitisation is so prolific, it's incrementally creeping everywhere, and it's up to Attorney Generals to monitor this, but every agency doesn't realise that they're one of another that is thinking of these kind of approaches.
Robo-debt, Chris, maybe an example of this.
It is. It's AI. That's a great example. Yeah. So, and I think everyone's learned from that, and it's been a bit more cautious about that.
Yeah, and you're right. One of the challenges was the onus of proof, or how did you go about, proving that, or responding to those calls to repay debt. The process wasn't clear, and often the government was imposing requirements on some of the most disadvantaged members of our community without the access to stable housing and the ability to keep records, and to be able to kind of demonstrate that they complied with the requirements of the social service programs.
Yeah, I think robo-debt demonstrates that to contest digital systems is actually hard, much harder than to contest the previous kind of paper-based personalised systems that existed. And that's just something we've really got to be cautious of.
Now we have a question from Tom, who's been waiting very patiently because I thought his question would serve us a bit later in the discussion. Tom. Oh, but you'll have to turn your mute off.
Okay, so that's cool. So Chris, thank you very much for your presentation. And I hope I'm not avoiding having the environmental video, which seems to be very popular. Is that going to come out?
I'll play it after your question, Tom.
Okay, we'll play it after my question. So my question is really just looking at this whole picture, and how far are we along a particular road, and where's the road going to go to? What's your kind of like picture of where this is all going? Because I guess just two very quick things. First of all, I've got my COVID double jab certificate, but at the moment I can't link it to my sort of New South Wales thing. So it does seem as though things that I would have thought were sort of 101 aren't happening. And also the sort of community response to some of these digital things. So, for example, monitoring parking. I mean, I just looking at different councils and how they monitor people parking in the wrong places. There's enormous kind of differences there, depending on what people see as acceptable. But anyway, let me just ask you the question.
No, thanks, Tom. Great question. Well, according to the Premier, I think the connection is happening next week with the vaccination QR code app. But it does give you an example. When I heard the announcement on the news last night that they expected that those two systems will be connected next week, I mean, in some sense, it shows you the speed of movement, that things move quite rapidly in the digital space. The other thing, I think, that the end of the tunnel, what worries me is what I mentioned earlier, is the gap is narrowing, but the hole is getting deeper. So exclusion becomes absolutely incredible exclusion. And one of the dilemmas, I had a discussion with, I don't know if you guys know, you might know Liam Smith from Monash. He does behaviour works and he does all that behavioural economics stuff. We were talking about this in terms of digitisation, that as people become remote, in other words, their engagement with the state through public sector agencies is digital, not face-to-face, we may get this very peculiar interaction where the only time you interact with the state face-to-face is when you're in trouble. In other words, you'll only see someone when you're detected breaking the law, or you see them at the airport because they're quarantine officers. Like, the interaction with the state becomes almost authoritarian because service, the nice stuff, is all put online. And so suddenly citizens' experience of what the state represents in a personal experience becomes more about enforcement and compliance and kind of problematic issues rather than the nice stuff. Whereas, historically our engagement with the state might be quite even in terms of nice interactions, friendly interactions about obtaining services and getting assistance, and also difficult stuff about when you're in a non-compliant state. But if we minimise that to around aspects of penalties and enforcement, that creates a different perspective about what government does, because government almost runs the risk of becoming invisible because, oh, don't worry, just do it on the app, click, 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 and you've got your payment. Oh, do this, click, click, click. You don't engage with a face of the state, and that could have quite unknown implications for communities in our understanding of what government does.
Well, I guess just in response to that, it could be that we save a whole lot of time and effort from administrative things, and that releases time and effort to put into sort of really proactive value-adding things. Or it could be that we sort of save the time and money and we just bank it, and it becomes, as you say, a very transactional and potentially negative experience.
Yeah, and I think what we saw in the digitisation strategies of jurisdictions, states like Tasmania and the Northern Territory articulated that they would do what you just said in that example, that services were saved, were to sustain interface so that they could do better at that face-to-face interaction for those that needed the interaction with government services. So that wasn't as strong in some of the other strategies that we saw in other jurisdictions. So there is that difference. If you go back to that very early thematic approach that we said, we tried to sort of illustrate what might characterise the differences between state strategies. That's one of the points that you've highlighted. I can show the video, which is kind of the digitisation of fish counts. It's a great little thing. I mean, can I show it, Louise?
Yes, please do.
Please do. Oh, I've got to put the sound on. Oh, sorry. I've got to put the sound on.
There's a number of shark species that have been listed as threatened or critically endangered. So it's really important that we're able to protect not just our marine environment, but the estuaries and the freshwater systems that these species inhabit.
It's probably the best harbour in Australia, really pristine. We've got more coral species than they do on the Great Barrier Reef, and that's why we need research projects that can ID species accurately to be able to get enough information so that we can accurately manage species and stocks.
Conservation is at the heart of what we do, and I feel very privileged and lucky to have the job I have. One of our biggest challenges is dealing with saltwater crocodiles. In parts of the Northern Territory, we've got some of the largest populations in the world, and we catch over 300 per year in Darwin Harbour, as we simply can't dive into the water to go and explore and to count and identify fish or marine species. And as a result, we've had to look at alternative methods, one of those being the use of underwater video. The problem we had was simply identifying fish in the video because you couldn't always see them very well. So the work we're doing with this AI and machine learning is really important to us.
The water is quite green. Fish move, so they change shape. They have different behaviours. They blend in with the reef. They blend in with each other. They blend in with the background. We've created an approach to detect the shape of fish in water and to count the number of fish and the different types of fish in water.
Once we had that first solution that could positively ID a fish and not identify it as a hot dog or an umbrella or anything else, we really felt we were onto something. And then from there, it was really a matter of then finding the right tool set to be able to improve and optimise our solution.
There is hundreds of hours and terabytes of footage that needs to be counted and quantified. We've taken that activity and reduced it essentially to minutes, which enables them to focus on the research and the analysis and the trends which inform policy rather than focusing on watching video. It's an incredibly exciting project because it has global applicability to quantifying fish stock.
Scientists and communicators and politicians and everyone needs to be thinking about marine conservation and how to apply technology to aid that, because if you're not thinking about it and you're not looking after it, then it's going to disappear really quick. I'm proud of the team that we're a part of and what we're doing here in the Northern Territory. We're a really small team and a really remote place, so to be able to do this quality of work is something pretty special. I wouldn't want to be any other place.
There we go. So, that's digitisation of fish counts in a dangerous environment, a croc-infested harbour. And I think it's a great example of digitisation in conservation, where we can really see work advance, and that's public sector agencies really taking the lead. So yeah.
Excellent.
And it's great to see, even fish aren't exempt from digital intervention. And if you thought you could go on holiday to get away from it all, you can't. But I'm all for a bit of policy-based tourism. So hopefully we'll all be able to, share experiences from other parts of Australia soon. Chris, I'd like to thank you on behalf of the community of policy professionals for taking the time to speak with us today and sharing your knowledge and your research. And I'd like to thank our audience for their interest and enthusiasm in policy. We'll be back in November with a presentation. Actually, we've got two presentations coming, but up in November, we've got Tanya Koneman, who'll be talking about cultural integrity in policy. And we've also rescheduled our presentation from Michael Coates-Trotter as well. So I look forward to seeing you all then. And thank you very much and have a great day.
Thanks, Louisa. Thanks, everyone. I really enjoyed it. Thanks for the questions. Great stuff. Got more homework to do now.